continuing the kind of colonial tendencies that have been around for a few hundred years. In some ways or the other, these kind of neo-colonial ways, these are continuing. But these movements of resistance and protest are important not just in terms of saying no to destructive development and authoritarianism and patriarchy and so on, but also in terms of articulating a different vision, a different civilizational vision of what it is to relate to the rest of nature and to each other. In this particular picture, it is from the 1980s of a movement against two mega hydroelectricity projects in central India, where what we call the Adivasis or the indigenous people were not just protesting against the drowning of their villages and forests, but also saying that this river, which for you is a commodity to produce power out of, for us, the river is our mother. And as our mother, we will not allow her to be shackled by your dreams of progress. So you see, in whether it's in this movement or in sort of similar resistance and protest movements all over the world, movements for new constitution in Chile, for instance, movements against extractivism, both in the global north and the global south, movements for peace, the youth climate justice movements, and many others. You actually see this combination of resistance, but also an articulation of different visions of what sort of world we want. But along with this, it's also very important that we look at and support and build on the radical alternative constructive movements that are initiatives on the ground, which are actually trying to provide for the basic needs and aspirations of people where they don't yet exist or where they don't have enough, whether it's food, energy, water, housing, etc., or health, or education, or voice in decision making, or gender equality, and so on. These are all fundamental needs and aspirations beyond that, which today's developmental model is actually not able to meet, or is meeting in ways that is trashing the earth. Now, here are alternatives where people are trying to do that in much more ecologically sensitive and socially equitable ways. Let me give a few examples from around the world as a glimpse. Now, please keep in mind that these are all complex stories. They are not all 100% successes. There are issues and problems with them. But I'm just giving a very quick sort of 1 minute glimpse of each of these, just to let us know what the potential is. Now, this particular example, I find the most inspiring of all the ones I've seen. This is from 5,000 women farmers belonging to the so-called Dalit or outcasts or untouchables of Indian society, right? So they are triple disprivileged in a patriarchal world, in a casteist world, and in a world which, where classism also exists. But in the last 35 to 40 years, they've transformed their lives from being ones of hunger, deprivation, malnutrition, etc., through collective action, bringing back their own seeds and knowledge with regard to agriculture, moving towards complete food security for households that didn't have enough food earlier, completely through organic farming in their own seeds, and then beyond that into food sovereignty, which is to claim complete local community control over everything to do with food, rather than corporate control or government control. They've also moved beyond that into creating their own media unit. They run a community radio station, they make their own films, and a whole bunch of other things, which has then transformed their lives, not just in terms of food, but also their social status, also their status as women. So this is, what you can see the potential of something like this from the most marginalized section of human society. You move over into Central West Asia, the area that is currently in the news because of what's happening in Syria. But if you see the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey quadri junction, 40 million strong Kurdish population that has been struggling for its own freedom, not its own country, and I'll come back to that, but its own freedom from oppression by these four nation states. And especially in Syria, in fact, in the Rojava area, very successfully trying to create a model of local eco-feminist based democracy where everybody is or should be having access to decision making, but where they also work with and within the limits of nature and with the earth, right? And through a very interesting worldview or cosmology called genealogy. Coming back to India and looking at an urban example, this is in Western India, in a very, very dry part of the Indian subcontinent, where this town, which has been exploding in population and has all the problems of towns and cities in the global south, lack of access to civic amenities for very large part of the population, pollution, congestion, everything. Here, several neighborhoods have actually been able to mobilize themselves to create for themselves much more dignified housing and living conditions, decentralized water harvesting, energy, and so on. Not just in terms of sort of technical solutions, but also the social transformations required to ensure that this happens. And then through that, arguing that if a city has to be planned and budgeted, it should be bottom up. It should be from the people for whom the budgets and the plans are being made, rather than by politicians and bureaucrats sitting somewhere in some city center. And of course, in Europe, and many of you I'm sure are familiar with this, in the heart of capitalist Europe, attempts at trying to create more communal living, attempts by workers to take over control and do collective decision making in factories, such as this one in Greece, where quite remarkably, every worker is given the same wage for every hour of work, regardless of what the work is. Things that are run through much less commodification and financialization through time banking, through communities providing free skills and labor, such as the school in Greece, and many, many more. So I think what we're seeing is that even from within the, let's say, the belly of the beast, so to speak, there are these remarkable transformations taking place. Also, changes in education. In a country like India, for instance, something like 90 to 95% of the schools are just churning out children to fit into the mainstream system, whether it's corporations or it's the government, right? And the values that are being taught to children are about competitiveness, about hostile competition, about individualism, about selfishness, and so on. Now, these are alternative education spaces in India and elsewhere, where learning is not just about cramming things into the heads of children, but actually creativity, fun, enjoyment, and learning from one's own culture, one's own natural surroundings, and also, of course, from other cultures and other parts of the world. So it is what Mahatma Gandhi called what we call the Nai Talim, or the new education, which is combining the head, the heart, and the feet. The head, the heart, and hands, and we've added feet and soul there. So basically, whole body education, which is also fun while children are learning, and learning also to become responsible as they grow older. And finally, the sphere of media and technology and communications, which also, as we know, is increasingly controlled by big corporations, which are hands in glove with the governments very often, as we see right now in the US, between Trump and Musk, or by government. So it is again very centralized control, and it is really controlling what news we're getting, what feed we're getting into our inboxes, and what sorts of technology is being produced, which is not really democratically controlled. So here are examples. These are mostly from India, of where people are trying to create alternative communications, alternative media forms, alternative forms of much more democratically innovated technologies and communally controlled technologies. And there's, of course, many other such things across the world, including things like open source software and so on. Okay. Now, having given some of these examples, and I could actually talk for hours about stories from all over the world. That's one of my favorite things anyway, just sort of listening to, understanding, and documenting these stories. But let's move now to the final part of the presentation, which is where I look at what are the alternative worldviews or visions of, I don't even call it development, because I think that's a word that should be discarded, but the alternative worldviews or visions or practices of well-being, of creating well-being for all, including, of course, for the rest of nature, not just for human beings. Now, one thing that we use here in India, and it's increasingly also being used in other parts of the world, both in research institutions, but also in grounded initiatives, is what we call the flower of transformation. If we were to think of change in these initiatives taking place in 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. A bit of an artificial way of dividing life, as we know, but of course, just to be able to understand what's happening, and also the intersections amongst these. And then if we were to especially look at what I would call the core of the flower of transformation, which is the ethics, the principles, and the values that emerge from these initiatives, then what are we seeing? Just very quickly, given lack of time, I'm not going to be able to elaborate this. What we're seeing is that If 2024 was supposedly a mega democracy year because 50% of the population of the world went to elections, went to polls, what these initiatives are saying is that's not democracy. That's a false vision of democracy. Liberal Western democracy is a false vision of democracy. If democracy is supposed to be about power of the people, then it is what we are doing in the Kurdish movement, in the Zapatista movement, in the indigenous self-determination movements, in the movements of urban self-governance, where we are holding power in our collectives, in whatever form our collectives are. And we don't willingly give over power to bureaucrats and politicians who we elect, right? So from that, of course, emerges that insofar as there are still governments, how to make those governments accountable. But power is flowing from below, not coming down from on top. And there are enough practical examples of this now in different parts of the world to show that it works, where in fact, even something like the nation state is challenged. Why do we need these political boundaries between nation states, which are hostilely competitive and so on? The second part of that, as important as the first, is that there is no point in us being local decision makers if we don't have control over our economic means of production, trade, and consumption. Which means that workers in factories, on the land, in forests, in the seas, wherever people are working and producing what we need for our lives, are the ones who should be owning the means of production, preferably as collectives and not as individuals. So many movements, for instance, have recommoned their private properties or are doing it. That includes knowledge, not just physical property. Many of the movements are saying that we have to bring back squarely into the economy relations of caring and sharing, not just financial relations. We have to recognize much more the incredible contribution that women or grandparents make in looking after children, for instance, right? So there's all kinds of fundamental transformations in the way we look at economy, and also, of course, economy within ecological limits. Both the words economy and ecology, as I'm sure you know, come from the same root, the Greek word oikos, which means home. And as a famous social activist, Satish Kumar, who started Schumacher College, said once long back to me, if ecology is about understanding home and economy is about managing home, how can we manage home without first understanding it? So economy has to be within ecology and not the other way around, or not ecology as a sort of externality. The third crucial sector of transformation is social. Unless we're also tackling both traditional inequalities of gender, sexuality, casteism in India, class, and so on, and new ones, such as the digital inequalities that are coming into our world, or class inequalities of new kinds, the first and the second transformations won't be adequate. In fact, they could lead to even further inequalities in some societies, right? So the third sphere of transformation is as important as the first two. Then there's a fourth one, which is reasserting the diversity of cultures and knowledge systems. So decolonizing our minds, creating the possibility of us being able to sustain, revive, or create new forms of diverse forms of knowledges and cultures, cuisines, language systems. In India alone has 780 living languages, which are slowly getting erased as homogenization continues to happen in neocolonial ways. So being able to sustain those and create new ones. These are all part of the fourth sphere of transformation. And the fifth and final, and to me the most important, of course, is for us to reinsert ourselves within nature. It's not humans and nature, it's humans and the rest of nature. Now, when we reinsert ourselves within nature, do we think of ourselves as a pyramid of life in which human beings, or like here you see the man, is on top, and therefore we supposedly have some moral right to dominate all other species? Or do we see ourselves as a circle of life, which is what most indigenous peoples have done for thousands of years? And through that, then say, okay, we are interconnected, we are kinship with other species. And just like we think we have souls or spirits, perhaps also other animals and plants also have it, rivers have it, mountains have it. So the struggles for this kind of creating this mutual respect with the rest of nature, and even the struggles for recognizing the rights of the rest of nature, of rights of mountains, rivers, other species, is also part of these transformations. Now, if you were to put all these five together, we come to a point I briefly mentioned earlier, which is questioning nation state boundaries or other political boundaries even within nation states, because a lot of these boundaries are accidents of either imperial history or colonial history or other kinds of things, and they have ended up cutting natural flows such as rivers being divided into 3-4 countries, which enables the country upstream to make a dam, which then destroys the riverine ecosystem in the countries downstream. Right now it's happening in China, for instance, which is going to be devastating to India and the northeast area. um, or it cuts cultural flows. People who used to be able to easily go back and forth, nomadic pastoral peoples are not able to do that anymore. Nomadic wildlife is not able to do, migratory wildlife is not able to do that anymore. If you look at South Asia as a region and what has happened to it in terms of the carving out of South Asia into these nation states. So can we begin to reimagine political governance and economic governance from a bioregional or biocultural regional perspective? And of course, this is now a movement in many parts of the world, not just here, where some of it on the ground, some of it conceptual, in terms of reconceptualizing political boundaries themselves. What is it that, in a way, kind of links these different, diverse, very unique movements all over the world? To me, what links them together, or what could be universal in a pluriverse. We use the word pluriverse because there's a multiplicity of these sorts of initiatives, and none of them can be encompassed within any other, is what we would call values and ethics and principles. So here's a list that we have learned from examples all over the world, of these ethics and values, which are very different from what the dominant system tells us. For instance, the fourth one, it's really about cooperation and not competition. It's about the commons and not about privatization. It's about not just intellectual labor, but also physical labor being valued. It's about not just the rights of human beings, but also the rights of nature. It's about the notion of enoughness, not just more and more and more and more and more, right? So there's many, many different things. And of course, while we're doing that, we also enjoy ourselves. So music and dance and art and everything. If you were to combine, and I'm sure all of you can add more values and ethics to this, but if you were to combine these, we would kind of say that these are worldviews that celebrate life, where it's not those who become rich overnight or famous overnight or powerful or whatever who are celebrities, but actually it's those Dalit women farmers who are making enough food for their own houses with not by not destroying the earth and by creating more equality. That's the celebrity, right? So it's those who celebrate life and not everything else this currently crazy world does. A quick glimpse of some of these worldviews. In India, a very ancient notion is what's called Swaraj, very badly translated as self-rule. But what it means is that me as an individual, my community, my collective, in whatever form it is, has freedom. It has autonomy. It has self-determination, but not at the cost of others' self-determination, freedom, happiness, and well-being. So it's a notion of rights with responsibilities, freedoms with constraints. And this is something that Gandhiji wrote a lot, Mahatma Gandhi wrote a lot about in many of his writings about what the true meaning of Swaraj is. And he cautioned us, he warned us that we might become free from British colonial rule, and we will become free from British colonial rule, but that doesn't necessarily mean we will have freedom. Because if you, within India, a certain class of people will rule all the others. If within India there is still untouchability, if within India women are still subjugated, then that's not Swaraj. Okay. So what we have done, some of us, is to sort of extend that to say it's not just responsibility towards other human beings, but also the rest of nature. So Eco-Swaraj, or a radical ecological democracy, all of us as decision makers, but with responsibility towards other life forms. There are similar worldviews across the world. Many of them are very ancient in indigenous peoples, but coming back in today's struggles against extractivism and against authoritarianism. Many of them are reinterpretations of major religions, which have unfortunately also become very dogmatic and very top-down hierarchical and creating divisions across the world. But so how does one reinterpret them from a more spiritual perspective? And which are also worldviews emerging from within the industrialized West, such as things like degrowth and ecofeminism. And again, to say that it's this pluriverse, none encompasses anything else, but they're connected through the threads of common values and principles. Finally, then, if one is looking at these hundreds or thousands of examples across the world, small and big, do they create scale? Do they actually challenge the macro political and economic structures? At the moment, no. But the ways in which to do that would not be about any one of these initiatives becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, which is called upscaling, the corporate model, nor can we copy exactly what one is doing and put it in place in our area, but we can learn the lessons, we can learn the principles, we can learn the ethics, we can learn the processes, do our own thing wherever we are, and then connect horizontally. Do the horizontal networking, equitable networking of a pluriverse of these sorts of initiatives to create scale. And that's actually beginning to happen with things like agroecology, of course, with the feminist movement and many, many others. And right now with also the ecological movement. Two attempts at trying to help with this in very modest, humble ways. One is located within the Indian subcontinent. It's called the Vikalp Sangam, or the confluence of alternatives, not a conference, but a confluence, a meeting ground where people exchange ideas, collaborate, do joint actions, do joint visioning of what kind of India we want. We meet physically. We've done about 30 such physical gatherings in the last 10 years. We what kind of we want. We document stories and put them out. There's about 2,000 stories on this website from across India. And then we do advocacy for policy shifts to the extent that we think these are needed. All of this is available online. I will put the links in the chat when I finish. So this in 2024, as India went into national elections, we put out this People's Manifesto based on our vision of what the country should be moving towards. And then learning from and this is a film that we produced just a few months back, which has examples of alternatives in different parts of India and sort of threads them together. And then learning from this, we began in 2019, we launched the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is an attempt to link networks like Vikalp Sangam in India, with Crianza Mutua in Mexico, and Crianzas Mutuas in Colombia, with MASA in Southeast Asia, with networks in South Africa, in Germany, many other places where there is already what we call weaving taking place. That is, movements are actually being woven together as a tapestry, horizontally. So to try and create that as a global network. And over the last 5-6 years, we've connected with many, many, many thousands of such groups, individuals, and networks to try and create more synergy, more global work, collective work, etc. Couple of books to mention, and then I'm ending. This book on the right-hand side is a documentation of about 110 essays, about 90 essays of radical alternatives from different parts of the world, worldviews, visions, cosmologies, philosophies, practices. And this is now available in 6 or 7 languages. And the one on the left is a kind of interesting experiment we tried. We asked 40 people who are well-versed in different aspects of life, sexuality and gender, conservation, agriculture, food, education, health, etc., to imagine India in 2100 as a utopian vision, come back to the present and say, okay, how do we get there? What are the pathways? What are the hurdles? What are the opportunities? So we've been trying to do this kind of both very grounded documentation and visioning, but also more utopian visioning, and then sort of combine these two. So that's it. I hope I've not taken more time than I should have. There's a lot more available on our websites. And Wendy, I'm happy to send you the presentation, which you also circulate. It doesn't have a copyright on it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. And apologies for remembering to record you within the first 3 minutes rather than at the start. Yes, apologies for that. That's too many memory things going on. I, as always, have a million questions, but I will open it up to the floor initially if anybody has any questions or any comments that they'd like to make. You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand button. Dominique, sorry, do you raise your hand? Do unmute even. You have raised your hand. You have raised your hand. Now unmute instead.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was very eye-opening and very encouraging, especially I'm an American, and seeing the things that are happening in my country over time, but also over the last 24 hours, focusing on exploring alternative futures and a more radical form of democracy in my immediate community. I just really appreciate the resources and the encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you. And well, my commiserations for what's happened there. But I guess all the more reason why we need to be together much more to be able to resist what's coming. And of course, similar trends in other parts of the world.
I guess that was, I will jump in
And
with
by the
my
way, just to quickly mention, sorry, Wendy, just to mention
no,
also
no,
that we
no,
do
no.
have very good collaboration with some of the American groups, those who are trying to struggle on the ground for both resistance and alternatives. So I'd be happy to put Domani you in touch with them if you'd like.
I would love that. Thank you very much.
So while we're waiting, if anybody else has any comments or questions, I just wanted to ask you, it's an ongoing question that I have in my head, is when we have this, and I think it was something that you discussed as well at the start of your talk about the methods of freedom and the methods of oppression sort of start to collapse within each other, and it's very hard to see which is which. But we've continually struggling. There feels like there's a continual struggle, which comes in these big waves. And where can we sort of find? I this only because I was listening to something on the English Civil War, which was 600 years ago, 500 years ago, and there were levelers and there were malcontents, as they called them at the time, but they'd essentially been working these groups, pulling down. I was sort of struck by they say the world turned upside down and they pulled down enclosures, they took back the land for the people, took back a reign of democracy, small groups, those sorts of things. And when you read it, it's my favorite period of English history. It's incredibly powerful. And it lasted for 12 years. And then they brought Charles II out of exile, having beheaded Charles I, and put him back on the throne. And then, English history carried on with its series of kings, queens, whatever. What do you think is going on when why are we in this continual battle? I guess is my overall question. Why do we see it all the time through history?
Thanks, Wendy. A big puzzle, I guess, for all of us. And I only have what I think might be some elements of the response. My thinking on this. So I think one of the things, if we learn, especially from, let's say, people like Gandhi, he said continuously that if the lessons we need to learn from history are about not just who should be taking over power, but rather how to transform power itself, right? So unfortunately, through most of history, we've actually said, okay, let's overthrow this regime, whether it's kings and despots and so on, or it's so-called democratic authoritarian governments now, left parties taking over instead of right-wing parties, etc. Those are the sorts of things that have been attempted. And this is where I think something like the Kurdish movement is very interesting, if one is to look, and there's now fortunately a lot of literature on it, is that they also started like that. They said, we want to create a Kurdish nation, right? A free country. But then within a few years of starting the sort of their movement, they kind of realized that doing that would actually just basically recreate the same situation that they're against, except that it'll be maybe Kurdish men and maybe a few women, mostly men, who will be sitting on top and dictating what happens. So they moved then rather sort of transform themselves into saying that we want freedom, but we're not creating a nation state. And in order to do that, it means we have to have continuous education, re-education, relearning of the entire population, including the non-Kurdish. They also said that this means that every institution of governance in the Kurdish area would be both the Kurdish and the other ethnicities, even though many of the other ethnicities are minorities. They also said every institution has to have an equality of genders, etc. Now, of course, it takes time to put this into place. You don't, these are social revolutions of many kinds, right? But what they said, or Abdullah Öcalan of the Kurdish movement said, or Gandhi said, is that unless we're transforming our social relations and our mindsets and our own spiritual selves into being those where power is power with and not power over, insofar as we don't do that, we are just going to be recreating history same way. We're not learning then in that fundamental sense. And this is why questioning what is really democracy is so very important at this time. Otherwise, we'll basically just be doing. So today is the Republicans, tomorrow is the Democrats, not that different. Okay, maybe not as mad as Trump, but nevertheless. Or here in India, the BJP or the Congress, whatever. Okay, so some are a little better than the others, but mostly power equations still remain highly concentrated. The economy, the models of economy remain more or less the same. And so it has to be that much more fundamental. And that's difficult. It is difficult because each one of us have to then take responsibility. We have to then say, okay, we can't be sitting and watching Netflix all the time. We have to say, okay, in our neighborhoods, I will be part of decision making, and I will force our neighborhood committees or our city governments to make sure that things are happening in the way that they should be happening. That takes time and effort, and unfortunately, most of us have got so brainwashed into what I call the remote control way of working, that we want to sit on our couches and not do this. I'm not talking about the people on the screen. I'm sure all of you are doing a lot of stuff, but most people, unfortunately, are like that. So it has to be much more fundamental in terms of transformations, I think, if we want not to be repeating history in the way we've been doing. So that's just some elements. I'm sure there's other elements that I missed out on, Wendy.
Yes, and I think that responsibility is really important. I was really challenged recently when we have an incredibly diverse student body at my institution, and we were talking about making moves to make the faculty reflect that. And I said, I think that's great. I think we definitely should do. And then I said that I have to step down because actually I'm the minority skin color in my institution, 100% the minority. And it was this sort of moment of, well, and then I could feel myself saying, well, I've worked really hard for this, or I do really important things, or I'm a really nice person. I actually at one point went, I'm a really nice person. And that sort of sitting with that discomfort is still something that I'm processing within my own self, of actually for the greater good may involve these moments of individual sacrifice, if you like, which then, I guess, as you say, with this brainwash thing where we're taught from birth that those sacrifices shouldn't be so hard. You can be a nice person, but don't be silly. Don't be silly about it. Be nice to people, but don't give up the things you've worked for because you deserve them. That can be quite challenging, I think. So I think that point you're making about the responsibility is really important. Victor, you had your hand up at one point. I don't know if you've still got a question or a comment.
Yeah, sorry. I have a water issue here I need to run to, but thank you so much. I use the post-development dictionary a lot. My question is about some of the ways that we try to move towards these alternative futures, and if the way in which we do it is helpful, if it reinforces the pluriverse, or if it actually counterintuitively reinforces the universe. So I think of examples like groups of people who try to attain self-determination, who are what we call stateless. Think of Palestinians, for instance, by trying to get into the community of nation states and become a nation state. I think of the land back movements where we talk about, oh, this land doesn't belong to these people, it belongs to the indigenous people, even though most indigenous groups don't have an idea of ownership. So it reinforces this idea that someone owns it. Or I even think of, you mentioned the rights of nature, that, the way to live in community with other parts of nature is to reinforce the idea that the only way that you have self-determination is if a an entity like a nation state confers those rights on you. And so I wonder if you think, is that silly to even think about that? Doesn't matter. We're just happy that people are starting to move in that direction, or is there something to these types of criticisms about the ways in which we're trying to move towards a pluriverse?
Thanks, Victor. I mean, absolutely important question and impossible to respond to in a couple of minutes, but let me try a few thoughts. So ultimately, I think we want the revolutions of the kind that I'm talking, right? I'm sure many of you are thinking of the fundamental transformations of the economy, politics, and so on. But we're also talking about transitions. Now, if in the transitional phase, certain policy shifts, such as the recognition of plurinationality in some of the South American countries, or the recognition of the rights of nature in a constitution or by law, if those transitional initiatives help us to move further towards radical transformation, I think that's fine. But if they're reinforcing the status quo, which is what you're pointing to, or if they're reinforcing a certain notion of how the world should be organized, like with nation states, then I think certainly it's a problem. And this is what the Kurdish movement realized, which is why I gave that example, right? Or this is what the Zapatista have realized for the last 35, 40 years, that we cannot, it's not about creating a Zapatista nation or nation state. And the same thing with ownership. In fact, right now, even in India, for instance, communities are fighting to reclaim rights over their forests, collective rights over their forests. Some of them are saying we should own these forests. Others are saying, look, we've never owned forests. We don't own nature. We should have collective rights to them, and we should have collective governance of them. In fact, rights is also a questionable term, but we should have collective governance over them, but not ownership, because we don't own nature. So this is actually even a sort of a dialogue or a discussion even within, say, indigenous peoples or progressive movements. And so the notion of ownership, the notion of private property, so part of these movements are also that, okay, I've been cultivating this land and I don't have rights to it, so I should have it, have my own individual title to this land. And then others are saying, but that's further dividing the community. Why don't we take collective control and then we all figure out who should be cultivating what, and then, have a long-term arrangement of that kind. So, Victor, I mean, so I think the tricky part becomes, at which point in time do we do what and do we argue what? Is it possible that even as we fight for these sorts of rights within a certain existing framework, we're also in the same movements talking about eventually we need to move beyond? If we're talking of rights of nature, eventually we need to move beyond towards a mutually respectful relationship with nature that's part of our every minute existence, and not simply because it's in a law. Rights of not recognized simply because it's in some law, because there's a law, there'll be 100 lawyers against us fighting against us anyway. So is it a pathway towards those fundamental transformations, or is it only reinforcing the status quo and taking us even further away from those radical transformations? I think that's the question to ask. And we use the flower of transformation for this, because if we see it from these 5 perspectives and the basic values, any move that we're trying to make or any demand we're making, it might be a bit easier than to say, okay, this is really moving us towards that radical transformation, or that it's not. Beyond that, it's very difficult to say because every context is different. So I wouldn't want to sort of say that in this context, this is what's right, in that context, that in all the contexts, this is what we should be doing. But I think these are absolutely valid questions that you asked.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I can see that Robert's put in the chat something which I suspect many groups of people feel at different points, which is, in the US, we're in perpetual transition and disruption of progress. The challenge from my perspective is finding the energy to continue to resist. And where would you, I mean, this may be a personal question, where would you find that you draw your energy from for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a constant question I ask myself, and others are also asking me. So I think for a lot of movements, it's really critical not to be only in a protest mode. This is where we lose energy. And this is, I think, the question also that that Robert has asked, right? So because the government or corporations are keeping us on our toes, constantly having to protest this and resist that and raise our voices and all of that, it's a very negative space we're in. And so for us, like the confluence of alternatives in India, we just had our national meeting with 150 people getting together. We said, okay, let's talk about our problems. We are in a context of serious crises. But then let's move over the next 3.5 days into looking at what are those radical alternatives already being practiced and what more do we need to do. So we then move into a more positive space, not neglecting the crises, but into a positive space which energizes us. Why I stay energized is two things. One, because I'm in touch with a lot of these grounded initiatives and they are laughing, they're doing what they can against the tide, but they are doing what they can and they're retaining hope. Me, with all my privileges, I have no right to lose hope and inspiration. But secondly, also constant contact with the rest of nature. That's a huge source of inspiration, energy, and hope for me. Even despite everything we're doing to other species, there is still profusion of life. Even in a city, one can find profusion of life, resisting, saplings growing out of walls, all kinds of stuff, birds visiting us in migratory seasons. I think the more we're able to reconnect with that, the more our energy is likely to be sustained. And this is especially important for today's younger generation, not as a sermon, but I work with a lot of people in their mid-20s, and just to be able to say, let's go out, be with the rest of nature, be with other movements, and otherwise climate anxiety, all kinds of other things are eating up our younger generations. And that's really, 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 really scary what's happening. So we need to be able to get this grounded experience for people.
Thank you, Robert. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's really inspiring. I appreciate it. And just from my perspective, I think I can do that individually. I live in the mountains of Colorado in a cabin in the woods. So I can connect to nature and nourish myself as much as I need to. But what I struggle with is the collective connection where I can assist other folks. Now, I teach at Saybrook University, which is a humanistic psychology school. So I have this amazing opportunity to work with some really wonderful colleagues and students. But I think the thought of 4 more years of chaos really moves us in a direction where we have to draw deep, deep, deep down and figure out a way to nurture your thoughts and your writings. And I don't want to lose hope, and I don't intend to, but it is a huge challenge. And thank you for the reminder that we need to, continue to connect with nature and with not even like-minded folks, but just maintain hope and find joy, in what we're doing. Thank you again for your thoughts. That was really wonderful.
Thanks, Robert. I think I've also been lucky in being in touch with historians who have been documenting how, for instance, 500 years of colonialism was defeated, right? I mean, of course, neocolonialism of various kinds still exists, but that form of colonialism was defeated within a space of 40, 50 years, right? After 500 years. Or people who are documenting, say, the feminist struggle, starting with a few brave women or other genders standing up and saying we want equal rights, maybe 100 years back or 150 years back, to what it is now, a global movement, a global narrative, and so much more has been possible. Again, patriarchy is still around, but not in many of its earlier forms, and so much else, right? So in that sense, I think if we're able to dig deeper into history and look at movements that have worked, we realize that, yes, we're in crises, we're in different kinds of crises, some old, some new, but movements have actually been able to create enormous amounts of transformation in the midst of what seemed to be very hopeless situations. The sun was never supposed to set on the British Empire, right? Now I'm not even sure it's rising on the British Empire. But so things can change. And I think the ecological revolution is really right now possibly something of the same nature, though it doesn't seem like it, but I think it is. And I think as somebody's put Havel's quote, this also comes from a lot of Indian philosophy. If there is something we feel we have to do, we just do it without sort of saying, okay, this will lead to this kind of thing. So that also is very, very important. It's a sense of, it's a passion. It's like, it's a sense of, it's a calling. We have to do this. So let's just do it and not worry too much about whether we're going to be, saving the world in the next 20, 30 years or 50 years or